Dosha, Gurgati Sajis, good morning and good afternoon to our relatives out east, and thank you for joining NDN's Live today. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm a citizen of the three affiliated tribes of North Dakota, the Director of Advancement here with the NDN Collective, and I'll be your host today. I'm calling in from Colorado, the traditional territories of roughly 45 tribes and the current home of the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Ute Nations. As we're getting going today on this hour, we'd love for y'all to post in the chat where you're calling in from today. And just to get through a couple housekeeping items, we are doing a live with panelists from all over the country. Please excuse if we have any digital hiccups. Just stick with us. Any technical issues, we'll do our best to remedy as quick as we can. We do have a live chat going. We ask that if you do engage in the chat, that you please be respectful of other posters and our panelists today. But please feel free to share any questions or thoughts that you have related to today's topic. So for today's call, we're going to be having a discussion on the changing landscape of Indian country and the relationship to the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. We'll be sitting down with some organizers and some people within the NDN Collective who are working in the realms of policy, climate advocacy, civic and voter engagement, and we'll kind of break down and think about what's occurred over the last 100 days and think about how, as Indigenous people, we'll be holding the administration accountable for their promises and how we can uplift Indigenous sovereignty and leadership. Joining us today will be Anathea Chino, Acoma Pueblo, and the co-founder and executive director of Advanced Native Political Leadership. Nikki Paredos, Boys Fort Band Chippewa. She's the NDN Fund Managing Director. Jade Begay is Tasuke and Dene, calling in, representing NDN Climate Action, our climate justice work, and then Dr. Kyle White of the Potawatomi Nation, the professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Michigan. Thank you guys all for joining us today. It's an honor to share some digital time and space with you. But before we get started, I'd love to give the opportunity for y'all to introduce yourselves and tell us where you're calling in from. Anathea, let's start with you.
Gawatsi. Hi, everyone. I'm Anathea Chino. My pronouns are she, her. I am from Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. So wonderful to be here with my Pueblo sister, Jade. I'm calling in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I just moved here a couple of months ago. So Lenape lands, occupied Lenape lands in Philadelphia. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Anathea. Nikki, love to hear from you.
Buju Ndinoe Maganinduk, Nikki Paradas Indigenous nominees Agigung and Dunjaba. So Nikki Paradas, I'm calling in from Dakota Anishinaabe lands here in Indian Collective's Minneapolis hub office, and I'm excited to be here today and to join some of my colleagues and some policy wonks. I think of myself as more worker bee in the field practitioner, but happy to be able to share some thoughts and learn from others today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nikki, and definitely last but not least, Dr. White.
Bonjour, everybody. I'm Kyle, and I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And I've been working for some time in the space of empowering Indigenous people for climate justice and environmental justice. And I'm calling from the Anishinaabe territory, Michigan.
Well, thank you all. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. If y'all ready, let's jump into the discussion here. Before we talk about the first 100 days or the last 100 days of the Biden administration's transition, I'd love to just go back in time a little bit and let's talk about some of the BIPOC and specifically Indigenous or Native organizing that happened to kind of get out the vote. And I'd love to just hear kind of what you guys were seeing from your respective regions and your body of work. Anathea, I'd love to hear what you guys were seeing kind of from a national level.
Absolutely. I think it was, the 2020 election cycle and just life in general, as we know, was deeply impacted by a pandemic that we've just never experienced in our lifetime. So in an election cycle where you hear that everything is the most urgent, not only were we coming out of an administration or coming, I guess, into an election that was going to impact the next administration, so much politically was at stake. But also our lives and the very ways that we often think of our lives are always under pressure, just generally in the best of times. But when you look at a pandemic, it was everything was heightened. So we were seeing a lot of national organizations that had been doing groundwork, and I have been kind of like teetering between politics and philanthropy for a very long time. And the adjustment of there had been a movement to move towards funding more field work, and then that quickly had to be like readjusted to make everything online and make all of the organizing virtual. So that was there was a number of things that were happening at that time, with Advance included. We were figuring out how to bring our Native Power Building Summit online, so we could we had planned on holding it in Phoenix, but of course had to make readjustments, and every single organization was doing the same. And additionally, trying to figure out how we're educating about the pandemic, about how we're doing political like election education, how we're sending out vote safe kits, and figuring out the ways that typically in New Mexico in the fields we're engaging in our community around food, we're bringing people together around events, and we had to figure out how are we doing that and connecting with people in different ways, engaging in text message programs. That's something that was that we're experimenting with. What I think that we recognized, at least from like Advance's point, is that we were founded in 2016. We hired staff in the middle of 2020 and went straight into the election cycle. And people had been asking, where's the national political entity for Indian country? Like, where are people going? National organizations had all been asking. And we're trying to figure out, like, and people are asking, like, does text messaging program work? Does email like outreach work? Do all of these, and there hasn't been a testing mechanism. We haven't been doing this for long enough for us to say it works in Arizona, it doesn't work in New York, it works in all of these places. And so we are at the very beginning stages of understanding how flexible we can be, and then further trying to figure out for the next election, having like a test case of 2020 and then using that for the midterms coming up in 2022 and then the next presidential in 2024. So I guess to answer your question, Michael, in a very broad way, is that everything changed, and the fundamentals of like how we campaign and connecting with people are still very much who we are, and we're central to.
It's one of those technical difficulties we were talking about there. I apologize. I want to back up a minute and turn it over to my co-conspirator and director of NDN's climate justice campaign, Jade Begay. And Jade, if you wouldn't mind doing a little intro, I apologize, and then pick up the question there from what you were seeing in the Southwest.
Yeah, no worries. Good morning, everyone. Yate Bene. My name is Jade Begay. I am, as Michael mentioned, the Climate Justice Campaign Director at NDN Collective, formerly the Creative Director, and I'm calling in from Ogapo'oge, my ancestral land here, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm Tesuque Pueblo and Diné. And yeah, I think what we were seeing, just in the Southwest region, as Anathea was talking about, just a lot of change in the organizing tactics, but incredible efforts. I think I might be dropped. Uh-oh.
No, from some of the stuff that was happening, those of us working in Indian country had been focused a lot on helping in some of the battle states. Arizona was one state that definitely received a lot of attention and a lot of resource direction. And we would say that those investments were done in good faith and for the right reasons. And so we saw an exponential number of Indigenous people helping carry a progressive vote down in Arizona. Nikki, you're there in the Minneapolis area, obviously, kind of the epicenter of a lot of social disruption and white supremacist law enforcement happening around the country, kind of a pinnacle and a powder keg of social demonstration and social justice this year. Can you talk a little bit about how the election unfolded in Minnesota or in the Twin Cities area with relation to the Native vote?
Yeah, I can try, but I will say there's others that do much better justice. As I said, I'm like, my background's in community development. Never thought of myself as an organizer before, and I'm just seeing though, even in my family and in our urban Native community here in Minneapolis, just so many people like me, right, that never considered themselves, um, activists or socially activated people like in these spaces. And I think part of just what has set the tone is just uh, increasing visibility in a number of spaces, increasing visibility for Indigenous people, right? We're always kind of talking about ourselves as the asterisk nation, and you can point to studies that show how underrepresented we are in a number of fields, but like in terms of our political representation, it's never been sure, but we're seeing that reverse trend. And that was years and years prior to like this moment. And so that I think has been part of the setting of the stage. I'd also say just thinking of and then thinking about other you know kind of accomplishments and feats. Even within Minnesota, we had our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, Anishinaabe from the White Earth Nation, one of the first and highest seats elected offices across the country. Um, we were seeing Senator Mary Kunesh, who's actually the sister of a previous boss of mine. We're seeing a lot of action, but we're also seeing a lot of social issues that have always impacted and affected us, also rising to public consciousness, um, including the treatment of not just our Black relatives, but also Indigenous relatives by the police, particularly in Minneapolis. I've done research and work on that. We can talk about that some other day, but I will say that research that we did kind of sat there dusty on shelves, and now it's front and center, right? So there's kind of an alignment of the visibility, social consciousness coming alongside of that. And then I would say there's other issues that are also raising just public consciousness among our Native voters, MMIW, especially because we have Line 3 here in Minnesota. So there's growing activism around those types of things, but also around this, the issues of man camps, and they're in our homelands. And so that issue is very close. And last thing I'll say is in terms of just the kind of the trend, it's like Minnesota Chippewa tribe, for those of you that might be out there, we've been going through in the last few years like constitutional reform. So I'd say there's just a growing consciousness among our peoples. And then you look at when other things happen, social movements need a collective consciousness, and that's also happening at the same time. So confluence of things, but really the pain of staying the same needs to be greater than the pain of changing. And I think we're all at that point now. Check.
Thanks, Nikki. I appreciate that analysis. Dr. White, obviously, kind of in the post-election craziness, we saw Michigan in the news quite a bit. Some of the election results being challenged by the previous Trump administration. I'm happy to say none of those lawsuits had any merit, and they were all dismissed. But love to hear from your perspective what was happening kind of on the ground with the Indigenous organizer.
Yeah, absolutely. The situation in Michigan was like deeply unacceptable. The voting margin from the presidential election 4 years ago was like 10,000 votes. And we had a governor that, among a number of failures, was responsible for the Flint water crisis. It was a horrible situation, and we had Line 5, Enbridge Line 5 pipeline, the Back 40 mine, which was literally threatening Menominee homelands on the Wisconsin side, their place of their origin story. And really, people of color, native folks, took power and control. And there were a number of organizations that were formed that really hit the digital space and organized very actively to make up for some of those voting margins. For example, the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, which is a coalition of people of color organizations, native people, and many others across the state, engaged in widespread election activities tied to environmental justice, reaching like 50,000 people in environmental justice communities. The Nishnabek Caucus and the Democratic Party did incredible efforts. And I think what I found was notable is that none of these efforts were about like, we're going to rally behind somebody else's party. No, folks were saying these are the issues that matter to Native people, to people of color. This is how we express them. And for everybody else in the state, you need to see exactly how that relates to the candidates that you vote for. And that was awesome to see. And I think we did turn the tide.
Things I love hearing about that is it really pushes back against these stereotypes that Indian country is some kind of monolith, right? And it really has a lot more to do with local traditions, geographies, culture, language, and relationships with the non-natives in the region about how we're building these political power bases. The exciting thing, I think, from a progressive standpoint, is how we're looking to coalesce this power for all the right reasons, for justice and equity for all people in the planet. So appreciate that. Moving on to our next kind of prompt here, Nikki, you had kind of alluded to this, but what we're seeing right now with regard to Indigenous people kind of ascending or matriculating into leadership positions, whether they're elected officials or policy professionals put into these roles. Obviously, we have a great celebration with Secretary Deb Haaland being confirmed at the Interior. Wahala Johns is now the senior advisor for the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Energy Policy and Programs. We also have a fair amount of Indigenous people now as deputy solicitors within BLM. In terms of how these positions will help advocate and advance Indigenous issues and continue to add to our visibility and our representation and decision-making tables, how do you see these critical actions in fostering future change? We'll start with Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I saw a lot in my work, especially on climate change, is there were different federal programs and agencies that certainly had made spaces for tribes, but that's not the same thing as actually having Native folks in the actual roles and having the responsibilities within those agencies. So just in the sphere that I've worked, I've seen a complete change in the composition of people that are involved in some of the organizations that are responsible for administering climate change programs. And for me, the difference in personnel, the difference in people, is a difference in ideas. It's a difference in knowledge, in dedication, in capacity. And so I've had a lot of friends who have said, well, I've got an opportunity to join, an agency or join the administration. Should I do it? It's like, yes. And not just because there's a space for Native folks, because there's already amazing people that you can work with, and you can build power in that way, and you can create change in that way.
Thank you for that, Kyle. Jade, let's same question for you.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, just to build on what Dr. White was saying, I think what is most exciting for me, and just to kind of lift up the exciting roles that Dr. White and I get to hold as members of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. In that role, what I'm hearing and seeing, and also talking with colleagues who are now in these positions, is that the administration is really centering and trying to embed equity into all parts of the federal government. And I'm really seeing people take meaningful action towards those, towards uplifting equity and learning what it means for different communities, marginalized or communities who have not been, at these tables before. So, with our work, really getting into the weeds of, what does equity really mean for Indigenous peoples when it comes to environmental and climate justice? What does it mean? What does equity mean in terms of energy and in terms of investments into Indian countries? So I'm seeing that being really taken to heart, and there's a lot of, I feel like people are really trying to hold that responsibility in a big way, and that kind of is giving me a lot of hope, a lot of inspiration to just keep mobilizing and organizing within our communities to really, guide and give advice to these different departments, these different agencies, to understand what equity means to us.
Thanks for that. And I think, as is central to NDN's mission and the way that we develop our programming, we really believe that the pragmatic solutions to the problems our community faces are found in the people dealing with those problems, not in academic or, technical deployments from people thousands of miles away from these issues. Anathea, I wanted to turn to you next. I know some of the work you guys are doing at Advanced Native Political Leadership in helping grow a cadre of Native candidates to start looking and running for public office. Can you talk about how that groundswell of Indigenous candidates is going to help us move past a place of or siloed or singular representation of Indigenous issues and start creating a context in which Indigenous people can participate in democracy?
Absolutely. I mean, like the way that we operate at Advance is a clear understanding that we know that this was not a political system that was designed for us to succeed. And the systems around that is that when we intentionally are decentralizing the power of white supremacy and the majority of straight white men in elected office, and we lean into and actively and intentionally diversify what the field of elected leaders looks like, is that the world looks different and policy looks different and the way that we govern looks different, and we bring in and we are mindful of, and the ways of our inherent values are of the community. So the way that we are moving forward in electing and recruiting more Native people into elected office is with this understanding of that we have an inherent right to be able, and and we are leaders. And so it looks like previous ways of electing people into office and previous training systems had been very much rooted in and kind of maybe not explicitly, but there was an aesthetic and there was an assimilation of elected leaders that had been kind of the standard. And there had been a lot of legacy people who were kind of their parents were in elected leadership, so they're in elected leadership, and then they hand that down through generations. And so we're looking at what it looks like, for us to recruit more people that are coming from different backgrounds. That we are looking at what it looks like for volunteer legislatures to be able to provide financial support for a single mother of four to be able to run for office, and that the financial restraints are not something that's going to prohibit her from being a leader in her community. What does it look like for us to really think through and support Two-Spirit and LGBTQ people into elected leadership positions where they are there to represent an entire community? And when we think of us being this a very small in population, large in certain states, but very small in the view of the United States, is what does it look like for us to actively work in relationship with non-Native communities and people of which we're all a part of. And one of the things that we recognized when in the very early days of our landscape analysis with Advance was interviewing people who would run for office. And so one of the things that they told us, at least one candidate New Mexico, who was running in a predominantly white neighborhood, said that, and she was an attorney, very well established in her field, and she was running for state rep. And she said overwhelmingly every single person told her that she was in the wrong district, and that maybe she didn't realize that she was like outside of like her district lines. And so we're dealing with asking people to like step into these spaces of power and to like consistently push forward and then hold them afterwards. So like we also as like a community can't, like, once somebody is running, is that we still have to be able to provide support for those people because we want them to get back in. It might be a different race, it might be a different time, but we want them to be able to like feel that the community is going to be behind them. So like that looks like us is like, it is a long-term trajectory of building political power that is inclusive of the partnerships of people that are doing the field work, because that's incredibly important, and people power is not to be underestimated in any way, shape, or form. And also working within the systems and then gradually changing them as we move forward by electing more people that look just like us.
Great. And just to finish up on this question, I wanted to circle back to Nikki. You had mentioned Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, and now she was elected on the ticket there in Minnesota back in the 2018 midterm elections. Can you talk about what having an Indigenous person in the second highest elected seat in the state, what is that? How does that change some of the conversation, or what are things looking like there locally?
And if it's cool, I'd like to do that and then also talk about the other question too, just the fostering change. But I will say the day that Peggy was elected with Governor Walz, and that's how we think about it. A lot of Minnesotans think it's the ticket's Peggy and then Tim Walz, and it's kind of funny. But yeah, I was at the time working at the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis, working on issues that affect right, Indigenous economic development in particular, and working at national systems levels with all the Fed agencies, and just seeing that systems change can be very glacial in a policy context if the right environment doesn't exist. So Peggy being elected, it changed many things. It reinvigorated and awakened like the native voter in Minnesota. If they weren't activated before and didn't believe that voice matters, that individuals collectively as social movements, as grassroots movements matter, I think her, being elected, holding that office changed that, which has certainly done things and allowed us to put more visibility and political pressure for issues like Line 3 in particular, which our governorship here so far has been in support of. And that's been very contentious, but it has allowed us to step into those spaces. So I think just being a very early student now to social movements, seeing that what they can do to drive change both in state and federal, not just elections, but policy, rulemaking, everything else is super exciting to me. And then just to be brief in saying that, seeing in all of these different positions locally and federally that we're having Indigenous people in key decision-making places, I'm like thinking of how this technically works on the ground. And I'm like, yeah, we need them in HUD. We need them at the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, because a lot of the things that affect our well-being, right, our economies, are tied up in a lot of those departments and places. And it's because we don't have people that have the technical lived experience of what doesn't work. So you have people setting policy, doing rulemaking, having oversight that don't know how things actually get implemented on the ground. So I think I think of Wahala being at the Department of Energy and being able to inform and actually provide real access, and that there can be interagency collaboration between these different appointments is just incredibly exciting to me, because I think that's where most of the bottlenecks happen. It's because those setting policy are not the ones who actually were impacted by it. So looking forward to more happening out of BLM, the BIA, so they're not stemming development by things that could be easily solved, with kind of the swath of a pen or the swipe of a pen, but just they don't get it, right? Who's ever been in those seats before? Okay, check.
Thank you for that, Nikki. I was thinking a lot about how, in kind of the post Standing Rock era, Indian country has some momentum and attention to the organizing that we are doing in our community, and the kind of self-empowerment and self-determination work that we're doing for our people is starting to transcend into different kinds of power coalitions in different spaces, i.e. this political space is something that's probably a little bit new for most of our Indigenous organizers, but absolutely part and parcel of how we're going to holistically grow power and prosperity for the future generations of our communities. Um, you know, we got a big win with the canceling of the permit on the KXL pipeline. We've seen things come out from the current administration, a $20 billion carve out for tribal communities in the new ARPA legislation that came through earlier this year. We have the new Justice 40 coming down the pike from the current administration. And at the same time, we're seeing other things around like the 30 by 2030 commitment. And so these are all like really good policy pieces that I think Indian country is going to be able to leverage in a way that we've never really had that kind of access and conversation with these administrations in the past. So kind of to that end, I wanted to get your guys' opinion and reflection on like, how do we as the people continue to keep the pressure on our elected officials to represent us in a good way and to not fall into some of the old habits that politicians fall into? And then at the same time, what can our elected officials and our policymakers that have matriculated into these administrations, what can they do to make sure that they're keeping an open line back to the community to help inform these things? Jade, let's start with you.
Ooh, this is a good one. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, first I think about the awesome report produced by Native Organizers Alliance and Illuminative, the Native Futures Report, I believe it's called. It might be Indigenous Futures. But they provided us some data points. I think one of the really stark ones for me, and this is in response to your how can elected officials or politicians, especially from the Democratic Party, work with us. And I think they should feel compelled to because of this report and what it found. So one of the really notable pieces was that 96% of Indigenous peoples that were surveyed don't trust the federal government. And they also found that 91% of Native peoples surveyed in that report don't trust state government. So I think that just kind of reaffirms something that we know from our lived experience, but puts it into, pretty plain data that there's a lot of trust building that needs to happen. And so I think that the Biden-Harris administration, elected officials, can really take some information like that and learn, that there are a lot of opportunities now, since Native folks had such a significant role in getting the Democratic or ushering in the Democratic victory. So now there needs to be that reciprocity around investment into our communities, lifting up Indigenous political leadership. I think bringing in Deb was a great step forward. That report also showed some of the top issues that matter to Indian country. I think at the top of that list was ending and addressing violence in our communities. And in the last few weeks, I think we've seen Deb create the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force. So, out the gate, when we have our leadership really truly leading, we see real results that impact our communities. So I think we can just, urge the administration to continue to bring our folks in, because of their lived experience, and like Nikki was saying, because they have that technical understanding as well as how to address the gaps that exist in our communities. So yeah, that's something that I think elected leaders and the administration can do. I think on the organizing side, what I was talking about earlier about this administration's commitment to equity, that's real, and I see it playing out. And so I think it's on us, and I want to urge grassroots organizations and colleagues to be doing that education. I know that education and building awareness falls on us a lot, and that's the labor we have to do as Indigenous people. But I think a lot of missteps, and I think a lot of this mistrust that we have with the federal government stems from just real lack of knowing, and it stems from invisibility, and it stems from erasure. But if we can be organizing and building materials and resources to really educate decision makers and people who are within the Justice 40 or who are building the Justice 40, who are building American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan, etc., and informing them what those solutions mean on grassroots Indigenous terms, then I think we can see better results and outcomes from those plans and proposals.
Thank you for that, Jade. Kyle, what are you seeing as some effective engagement strategies, or what is your community thinking about how they can leverage access in these times?
I appreciate the critical points that Jade made about trust. I mean, it speaks so much to the landscape, at least that I work in. And for many of the folks that I collaborate with, that I work with, that I engage with, we really want elected officials and agency leaders to actually be fluent in how Native folks understand the issues that we're facing. I mean, take, for example, Justice 40. Justice 40 is going to have in it commitments to renewable energy and to resilient infrastructure. And I think politicians and agency leaders get into the habit of thinking if you tell people there are funding options for a desired goal, then that's it. But for Native folks, right, it's not just that new infrastructure that we need. We've got a backlog of billions in infrastructure going way back, right? So if I'm talking with Native folks, and I mentioned renewable energy, that already implies there needs to be a solution to the backlog of infrastructure issues. And so the folks that we put into office and the folks that are now empowered into leadership need to get that fluency. If they are proposing to support Native communities facing coastal erosion exacerbated by climate change, it's not just enough to address that particular location, but the history of land dispossession that those tribes, that those communities have been calling for change on for generations. And I think in terms of accountability back to us, leaders and politicians need to also make sure that some of the things that we're calling for are not excuses. So, for example, a lot of us have called for improvements in tribal consultation. Just because tribal consultation improves, which it needs to be, that doesn't mean that that's where engagement stops. Politicians and leaders need to engage all facets of Indigenous people, not only our leadership and staff of our tribes through consultation, but our grassroots organizations, our community organizations, our traditional organizations. There needs to be that complete communication and accountability. And so none of these reforms can be taken as an excuse to ignore the overall accountability measures that need to be taken.
Thank you for that, Dr. White. Final on this one, Anthea, last thoughts about how we can continue to create access and move forward in a good way with this administration.
What Dr. White and Jade say is just so I just tack on to what they're talking about. And one of the things that we know is that culture moves faster than politics. And so when we we witness the power of people movement and this radical change that we are seeing in our generation, that is just that is deeply motivating and that's affirming of how much we can do and how powerful we are. When Jade was talking about the organizing, how critical that piece is towards moving anything. And we see like the impact of Standing Rock and the movement for Black lives in critically changing policy that would never have been thought of before. And so we think of like ways and like figuring out ways to make that then those moving organizers into leadership positions, and then ensuring that the work that organizations like Illuminative to continually bring them into the conversation, because it is critical that we are also changing narratives and that we're highlighting spaces that are representing us incorrectly, where we are not visible in all of these different ways, because that impacts the way a voter is going to choose to support a political candidate. On the accountability piece, we think of like there's a number of different ways that like we approach this. Is that we want to elect leaders who are going to stay. So that means that we have to be able to support them to stay in these roles. And I think of Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's one of our co-founders of Advance, and we're in constant communication around building our training program, and also the really tough months that she's had in the last few months around the Chauvin trial, and really thinking about what it means to kind of like to hold our leaders accountable to the community, and then also to support them so that they have what they need in order to stay there and continue to protect the community. And so there's a lot of different ways that we're having to hold a lot of different truths in these positions, and figuring out like how we are consistently keeping our eye like on how we're going to for the long run make the future better for like make I guess the political landscape better for future generations. So it is like they just affirming what Dr. Wright and Jade said, is that we have to be able to build trust. It's so much harder with access to so much information. We talk about the impact of misinformation and disinformation, how easy it is to get information that is going to be harmful to our communities. So what does it look like for us to be really mindful about what we're putting out into the world, and like making sure that it is accurate, that is truthful, and then consistently doing that over and over and over and over again. And then being mindful also of how culture is changing. You know, we talk all the time about like what it's like for like shows like The Office, or, you know, that like we like at one point seemed really bold, and then now we look at them and they didn't age well. So we need to hold our leaders accountable also to how the world is changing and how we are protecting everybody in these spaces of what representation looks like, of the fluidity of being human. And so we need to be able to surround our leaders and be able to tell them like we actually don't do that anymore. We say our pronouns, we honor our like the vastness of who we are, all of these spaces that we are consistently thinking of, that the world is changing very quickly and sometimes too quickly for some of us, but we have to scramble to catch up. And organizers generally are on the very front of all of that, and making sure that everyone is protected and moving towards equity. So it's all of the pieces have to be working together.
Thank you guys all for that. It's such great responses and conversation here. I'm honored to be here with you, so thank you. Before we get into some more specific questions that I wanted to prompt you guys with, I did just want to give a shout out to all of our viewers. If you aren't following us on our social media channels, you can check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Gee, I think the team even started TikTok recently, so you can go find some fire over there on that. So diving in a little bit more specifically about some of the stuff that's happened over the last 100 days, Nikki, I'd love to start with you, and let me cast the question this way: the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan, all in some ways have provisions or carve-outs for Indian country in a variety of ways. What are some of these components that you're feeling the most hopeful about, and where do you really see our communities being able to take advantage of these offerings? And the corollary, what might you be concerned about in there?
Yeah, Chimugwech, Michael. So the big thing, right, is $31 billion for Indian country. It's the largest, right, amount of federal funds that we've ever seen. But working, again, through past experience and present, just seeing set-asides, it's definitely not enough. So it's exciting to see how much money is coming to our tribes. What I am hopeful about in different parts of the plan, like the infrastructure bill that has been, I think by critics called like the Trojan horse, because it does address racial justice and equity. It does address climate justice and resilience, and it's very holistic. And that is the hope, and that it also builds within it things that highlight and prioritize communities like ours. For example, a lot of funds within that 31 billion that will be going towards improvements in water, in roads, and being able to be able to lift up, like, in communities that we know that are have billions of dollars, like you said, Dr. Kyle, and like past due improvements. Those are prioritized, right? That they're going to do a lot of, like, kind of the guts of the infrastructure that we need. That it doesn't get addressed because it's not very sexy, but it leaves our communities with, issues around clean access to clean water, basically all the fundamentals for development to really happen, for our communities to flourish. I see that the jobs plan, the Rescue Act, they're addressing those things, and that is incredibly exciting. But then I'll say on the other side of the coin, I would like to see more for capacity building, for helping work with our communities and teaching us and helping direct us in how to access those funds. Because even now there are billions and trillions that sit on the table within our federal agencies and with current funding, that our tribes don't access, and transparency, trust, all of those things are needed. So I would like to see, I'm excited about what I do see. There's like 1.3 billion for housing. There's a lot of money for small business development. Trillions, if you think about all the different doors they're opening. But again, these programs really get to the businesses that are intended. And even in the first round of the stimulus, less than 1% of Native businesses access those PPP loans, paycheck protection loans, access those economic injury and disaster loans. So I think it's wonderful how much money is set aside, the intention of human capital, workforce development, living wages, thinking about how to basically set our entire economy, national economy and tribal economies, for a clean energy future. But I think there should be even more to be done to make sure we can access it, and to provide the true training and human capital development that's needed. It's a lot, but it's an exciting time.
Thanks, Nikki. And, when we crack open the details of what's happening with that $20 billion carve out for Indian country, we see some very interesting allocations. There's a $20 million set aside with the ANA to help support endangered language revitalization and working with children in community. Those are the kinds of things I'm really hoping people are able to take advantage of. But in addition, we saw allocations for domestic violence prevention and helping communities create systems to protect their vulnerable populations. We saw money come into education, into HUD, and into IHS or into healthcare systems. Kyle, I'd love to hear your opinion on where some of the most practical wins are going to be for our community to leverage these resources.
I think one of the areas where we can have a lot of integration, so cross-cutting integration, where we understand that issues of economic issues, issues of violence, environmental issues are wrapped up together. They're all related to each other. And climate change, I think, is one of those areas where if we address it holistically, if we address it in a way that brings together all those aspects of it, both in terms of preparing for climate change, but also stopping the causes of dangerous climate change, I really think that climate change, climate justice can be a key organizing principle that can provide that integration. And in some of the work that I had started doing some years ago on empowering tribes in their climate change planning efforts, it wasn't fun at all because the federal funding, right, just basically said that climate change refers to one very particular tiny area of analysis of very small particular vulnerabilities in some environmental sector, right? But Native people are not thinking about climate change in that way. I mean, earlier, Nikki mentioned the man camp issue, right? Gender, sexual violence tied to the actual industries that cause the rise in global average temperatures through their activities. And so we can take climate change and use that as a theme that brings together language, right? The knowledge about climate and the environment embedded within indigenous languages, expressed through those languages, the connection to housing and building codes. I mean, Nikki makes great points about infrastructure, the idea of tribal energy independence, the idea of tribal wisdom in terms of short-term and long-term planning. And one of the key things that I'm seeing really begin to change is the idea that tribes actually aren't just local communities. That's a creation of colonialism, right? I mean, back in the day, we were regionally coordinated, we were diplomatic, we were all over the place and knew how to back each other up. And now it's not just an issue of, well, how do you allocate funds for a local tribe to deal with a local climate change problem, but how can tribes actually be coordinating leaders across state and counties and all sorts of other people that are affected by climate change too? How can tribal knowledge, tribal principles, tribal understandings of leadership really be the key glue that brings us together to address climate change in all of its different facets?
Thank you so much for that. I would like to subscribe to your newsletter, so please let everybody know where to do that, Dr. White. In the interest of time, I want to leave a couple minutes on the back end here to see if we field any questions from our viewers with us today. But last question for Jade and Anathea. What can be done? What more can be done by our communities to continue to put the pressure on this administration? And where do you guys maybe see some wins in the next 100 days? Let's start with Anathea.
I see some wins in the number of people signing up to run for office. So we set a goal to recruit 100 Native leaders in the first 100 days of the administration, and we hit that within weeks of 2021. Every single one of them is would be a first time candidate, had never thought about it before. Every single one of them has mentioned the representation of Congresswoman Sharice Davids and Secretary Holland, and talking about being inspired by seeing people that look like them in these spaces. So the wins of being represented in a number of different places is palpable. It's clear. People are seeing and wanting to be in these spaces. So that is a huge win. I think what people can consistently do is pay attention. I think we can't, one of the things that was very clear, and I think of this all of the time with regard to judicial races, which are always go under the radar, is that judicial appointments and elections are wonky. They're complicated. They're hard to understand. People don't pay attention to them, and they dictate so much of our lives. And so there's a number of different ways that we can consistently be looking for trusted sources of information when elections are happening and vote. But we cannot afford to not engage in this system, and then further working always to change it from within and around it. So those are mine.
Thank you so much, Anathea. And finally, Jade, I know we got a mantra over here, right? Organize forward. It's not really a time to take a break, but how are we going to radically imagine that future that better supports equity and justice for all people? So kind of the same question back to you. Where do you see the opportunities to keep organizing and pressuring the current administration? And what do you see as maybe some big wins that might be achievable in the next 100 days?
Thanks, Michael. I think there's so much potential. I also want to acknowledge that there's so much to grasp and understand, and things are moving really fast. We have progressive agendas like the Thrive agenda. We have the Green New Deal. We have to track those things, and then we have, what's happening in the administration, like the jobs plan, the families plan. We have new initiatives like America the Beautiful, which is being launched by the DOI, and that pertains to conservation of lands and has threads to land back and how Native peoples conserve and manage land. So there's a lot to track, and I just want to kind of acknowledge that and say, that it's important to track those things. It's important to have all of those things on the radar if you are organizing at the intersections of any of these issues. And I really appreciate what Dr. White said about climate justice and the work around climate change being a way to mobilize and organize on all of these issues, and continue to highlight the intersections to all the other issues like racial equity or housing or having safe jobs. It's all integrated into climate justice, and that's really the work that we're doing here at NDN Collective. And I hope with our campaign we can be a resource in really breaking down, all these different plans and agendas to you all. That's why we're here today. So I think, just off the top of my head, line 3, Dakota access, those come to mind as things that we just need to keep talking about, right? Like, it's half the fight with politics is like a narrative battle, as Anathea said. So, continue to talk about these things, continue to write op-eds, organize in your communities, put pressure on local leaders, just make noise so that these issues stay front and center for the Biden-Harris administration. And then, I think, what folks have been saying about Native leadership, we're definitely moving away from just Native representation, like being tokens in rooms. We're at the table now making decisions. So I think, just to uplift what Anathea was saying, we need to begin planning for next year. Midterms, they're going to be here any day now. So how time has been weird in the pandemic era, just it flies. So I think we need to start planning and working and collaborating together, and learning from last year on what tactics and strategies worked so that we can be really strong next year in the midterms.
Thank you guys for that. There are a couple questions regarding some of the reports that we've referenced here. We'll put together a list and put them on the live feed on our Facebook channel. We'll link out to the Indigenous Futures Survey by Illuminative. And then Anathea, one of the questions maybe you could speak to from the audience. Where can people find some access to training and curricula for how they might be able to help build this kind of civic engagement power in their communities?
It's a good question. I think that, so you can go to our website at advancednativepl.org. If you are looking to run for office yourself, we have a Google form there with just a few questions just to better understand who you are and kind of like what race you are looking at and that sort of thing. And then we're moving through individual interviews with people to better assess what are the priorities for training that we're creating for people. The other place is there's a number of different organizations that are doing this. If you are a woman, there's an organization called She Should Run that is really fantastic and has a lot of general information about what is this running for office anyway? Do I want to do this? I don't know. Like what district, what are the offices that are available in my district? There's another resource to be able to go through, and they have very high level, broad, nonpartisan information on what is available as well. But yes, our website, She Should Run, they're really fantastic. There's a number of other political training programs if that's the direction that you're going in. And Native Organizers Alliance is, like Dear Friends and Partners, also doing the grassroots organizing and training around grassroots organizing in the communities, which is also incredibly helpful. And then hoping to build a pathway to elected leadership through Advance.
So much good information for all of the people who tuned in today. We appreciate you sticking with us for this hour. I urge you to go ahead and follow all of these amazing panelists on their social media channels and the great work that they're doing in their organizations. And I would just like to extend a mazagiras. Thank you guys so much. My Hiradza language. I thank you and I honor you for being here with us, relatives. And thank you very much. And on to the next.